Humanist Perspective, presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people, living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Humanist Perspective. I'm your host, Jim Dugan. Our guest this evening is Heather Johnson, a research assistant professor at Tulane University. She holds a JD and is on the verge of completing a PhD soon, gratefully soon, in higher ed policy. Did I say that right?
Yeah, actually it's one of each, so higher education and in educational policy, okay. But yeah.
And so tell us a little bit about yourself, just so we can get started here.
Sure. Like you said, a professor at Tulane, came to this work with a background in law and in education, thinking about the intersection of gender, law, and leadership. And so I think we think about what does the diversity of the law, and in this case the judiciary, look like from the standpoint of women and of non-white judges.
Mm-hmm. And you've recently been the first author on a report called The Gender and Race of Louisiana's Judges, 1992 to 2017, with associates at Tulane, yes?
Yeah, so I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Sally Kinney, the executive director of the Newcomb College Institute, and do this longitudinal data study about gender and racial diversity. So very excited to talk with you about all of the findings today.
And how did you get involved in this particular research project? What prompted you?
So, I think Louisiana is an interesting state. So it's a state that elects their judiciary at every level. That is not the case. Not all states elect all judicial offices. And so its data is publicly available. And so I think in conversation with the Secretary of State, we obtained the data starting in 1992, and we were able to ask some questions at the individual level that are not common, that haven't been asked of state level data in this manner. And so I think I came to this work very much excited to see what the data would show, what we could learn about gender and racial diversity in the state of Louisiana.
And what kind of data were you looking at? Where do these things come from, and what kind of data elements did you have to work with?
Sure. So I think the key variables, this data is collected on the candidate information form. So when a candidate runs for elected office, they fill out the form and they file to become a candidate. And it's a short form, their name, their race, their sex, their party, and a couple of other personal details. And so the three key variables that we were able to collect, again, race, sex, and party. And for the federal judges that are described, we provide federal level data for judges serving the state of Louisiana in a federal capacity, so the 5th Federal Circuit, the Western, the Middle, and the Eastern District federal courts. And we also have the race and sex variables, as well as the political party of the appointing president as a proxy. And so we used a number of sources in addition to the Secretary of State data, basically publicly available data for the federal judiciary, for the archives, and then if we needed to verify that information, Ballotopedia or other publicly verifiable sources.
So it sounds like it was a fair amount of work. It wasn't just getting a couple of forms and tallying things up.
I mean, I think we were very lucky to have access and to have a great working relationship with the Secretary of State. So we're very thankful for that. But yeah, there's a fair amount of data cleaning and analysis that goes into putting data in this nature together. Yeah.
So before we start grappling with some of the details, is there something you'd like to tell us about the general outcome or the general findings, just so we know where we're heading with this?
Sure. So I think the thing that I'll say, there's actually two things. So first is that previous reports have given a single snapshot. So they've looked at 1 year. So this is the first time that we've had a single source of data that's looked longitudinally over the course of 25 years. And so I think we're very excited to see what those trends would bear, what they would show. I think that there's no surprise that we are, big picture, that progress is slow for both the gender and for racial diversity, and that we see small incremental gains, but it is not reflective of what the number of women or the number of non-white individuals in the population.
So maybe we should start getting down into some of the details. Like, I know you started with where does Louisiana stand now at a state level, and we actually have some detailed information to look at.
Yeah, we do. In fact, if we could put up there's the second slide. We can look at quickly the snapshot of Louisiana state judges for 2017. And so this table shows the 2017 data, and you can see highlighted in red at the bottom that it has the total number of judges based on for black women, white women, and other. So just a quick note about the categories here. So you can see that in 2017 there are 51 black women, 65 white women, and 1 woman with a racial designation of other. And so that's by virtue of the way the Secretary of State codes the data. Those are the 3 options that are provided. So anybody that doesn't mark themselves as either black or white has the opportunity to mark themselves as other. So that gives us a total of 117 women for almost 32% or 31.88% of women in the judiciary. So I think that's slightly improvement from the 2016 numbers, and it's not something that we were surprised to see, and yet still fewer black women than white women in the judiciary.
Compared to the population in general.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think we can go back and we can think about women constitute 51% of the Louisiana population from our last best census estimate based on the 2016 population estimates, and yet women judges only comprise 31.88 of all the federal and state judges that are active.
Is some other state information that we're going to look at?
Yeah. So the next slide, if we go to slide 3, we have we can put up the same table, but only this time for racial demographics. And so again, we have the number of candidates that indicated that they were black, white, and other. And as you can see, that it's 23.71% of non-white judges, and that's because we do add the black and the other category together for that total. So a total of 87 non-white judges out of 367 judges in the state of Louisiana. And just to give the same type of statistic, racial minorities make up 36% of the Louisiana population, and so non-white judges make up that 22.27% of all federal and state judges. And so, again, not as high in terms of number of women in terms of non-white judges.
And well, let's go one more slide, and then we'll ask a couple questions about the Louisiana state statistics.
Okay. Well, so actually, I think it might be best to take the questions now because we're going to switch to the federal snap.
Okay.
Oh, well, we'll talk about party if you want. You want to talk about state party?
Sure.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't jumble it up there. So the next slide. So this is slide 4. Well, what about party? I think interestingly, in 2017, every non-white woman in the court system is a Democrat. We have one that composed of 3% Republican for black men, the rest Democrat. And then you can see that in terms of white women and white men, that the majority are Republican, and then there is a number of other parties that make up a smaller fraction of the pie. And so just to kind of like think about this in actual numbers, all 51 non-white women elected to the judiciary were Democrats, and 32 of the 33 black men elected to the judiciary were Democrats.
So it's interesting how strongly correlated party can be along gender and race lines.
Exactly.
And I know you've looked at some of this data over time, and I'm not sure how much is changing, but of course it takes time to feed people through the pipeline into I can almost say it, judicial positions. And are most of these candidates coming from in-state? Do we have that information? Or?
Sure. Well, so yeah, you actually have to be a resident. There's a residential requirement in Louisiana in order to run for an elected official, and it varies by position. But most people, typically the trajectory for someone that runs for judge is that they are licensed and barred in the state of Louisiana. Most of them have attended a Louisiana law school, the majority, and then they will practice or serve in a public defender position or in some judicial capacity or litigation capacity, and then run for election as a judge. And so these are people that are not only very familiar with the area that they're running for elected office, but have lived here for an amount of time, depending again upon the spot that they are running for.
So we're talking about people who have to graduate from high school, go to college, get a JD, practice law, and all that has to be part of the pipeline that feeds people into becoming judges.
Absolutely, and I think it's one of my favorite questions is the pipeline question, because we can have a leak at every single one of those junctions that you just mentioned. So if we are not graduating the same number of women and men at high school, or the same number of racial non-white students at the same rate as white students, they're automatically going to be at a disadvantage of going on to that next ladder in that pipeline. And I think once we get into the longitudinal data, after we take a look at the federal snapshot, we'll really be able to see, even within the court system, how it's progressive. So typically someone starts at a city, parish, or a district court level, and they serve for a term or 2 terms, and then they run for election for a higher court. The other thing that we see is that in the past, traditionally, presidential appointments have been from the Court of Appeals or the district court level to the federal courts. So most people that are nominated to a federal court position have served in a lower court position. And so you also have those levels of the pipeline, even beyond the education and the practice.
So maybe it's time to take a quick look at some of that federal data.
Yeah, all right. So we can click over to the 5th slide. And so this is a little bit larger of a table. What I'll draw your attention to is it has again, this is number of women judges by race for federal court serving Louisiana. And you can see in the bottom in the green box, you have the total number of active federal judges, and that's 36.67%. And so I'll take a second. Active judges are judges who have been nominated, appointed, are serving, and have not yet reached what they call the Rule of 80, or haven't served for 15 years, or turned 65, so that they basically are what they call senior status judges. And so the reason that this number is important is if we look at the number highlighted in red just below it, so that's the total for all active and senior federal level judges serving Louisiana, we see that the number of women drops drastically to 28.85%. It's an 8-point drop, basically. And so when we think about who makes law for Louisiana, it's not just active judges. Senior status judges can serve in a semi-retired capacity until they choose to no longer serve. I mean, some 2 judges, in fact, have been on the bench for over 40 years making law.
That's a long time. 40 years.
As a federal level judge.
As a federal level judge.
That's right. And
that's
so,
longer than many Supreme Court justices at the federal level manage to serve.
And they've made a lot of law, and they'll, and so we think about what does it take to overturn a precedent? Well, if they wrote that particular law, then it may not be something that's challenged or overturned or overlooked.
We have also I'm getting ahead of myself. We have more federal data. I
We
was
do.
about
We
to
have,
jump ahead.
yeah. So I think I would love to go to the next slide, to slide number 6. This really looks at the racial demographics for federal courts serving Louisiana. So the same table, but with the black, white, and other designations for each of the federal courts serving Louisiana. And here we see those numbers again that are even less than the state snapshot for state-level judges. So for total active federal judges, only 20% of the active federal judges. And so if you think about it, it makes sense. The judges that have been nominated more recently are more diverse. That's what it's telling us. These are the younger judges. But when we look at everyone that sits on the federal bench that makes law, it's only 15.38%. So right at 15% of all federal judges serving Louisiana are non-white. So I think that there's a long, we have made some progress on the state level, and we're not yet seeing that translate to the federal level.
And that pipelining is layered and layered, and it takes decades and decades to feed it all through.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have the Western District of Louisiana that there are 7 seats, and there are currently 5 vacancies on that court, and they have 0 active or senior status non-white judges. And so there's a real opportunity right now to think about who we're nominating and to make sure that we think about diversity in that nomination process.
And again, there's that really big difference between, at the federal level, more nomination-based, and whereas in the state level, people can actually run for many of these positions.
Absolutely, right. And yet, I think, it's important to point out, let's think about who the president is nominating. So the president nominates. It's usually done with a home state senator blue slip process with the approval of the home state senators. And then that goes to the Judicial Committee, and they have a hearing, and then they take a vote, and then that is, of course, voted on by the Senate. And so there's lots of ways that citizens can be involved, calling their senator, working with organizations like Louisiana Courts Matter, to really make their voice heard, to say that diversity is important. And I think experience is important to
I think
try to
most of us have probably never heard of Louisiana Courts Matter. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Louisiana Courts Matter, so for New Orleans, Clay Latimer, who is an attorney, and then Ina Davis, both are the co-directors. They promote a diverse and independent federal judiciary. You can find them on Twitter at LA Courts Matter. They also have a Facebook page at Louisiana Courts Matter. And the whole mission of this organization is nonpartisan, but to basically watch the courts and to keep tabs on what the state senators of Louisiana are doing. And I think particularly Senator Kennedy is interesting because as the new state senator of Louisiana, he was given an appointment on the Judiciary Committee. And so he has the opportunity to be very influential about every pick to the federal bench across the United States. So when Louisiana citizens get involved, not only are they impacting federal decisions made for Louisiana that serve on the Fifth Circuit, but they actually have the potential to, lobby their senator to make a difference for every federal court position. So I think it's very important.
I think it's probably fair to say that most citizens are probably never even aware that a nomination might be pending, and one place to find that out might be through Louisiana Courts Matter.
Yeah, absolutely. They have great up-to-the-date information. They're happy to come speak and do community outreach or education to anybody that would like to have more information. And I want to make sure that in addition to contacting Senator John Kennedy, that it's really important to also know about Senator Bill Cassidy and that, the other Louisiana senator. Both of them matter. They have to, be a part of the process, of the nominating process. And so, contact Louisiana Courts Matter for more information, and I think get involved because it's definitely a process that has a lot of I guess, points for people to have a voice be heard.
Mm-hmm. Are we ready to move on to? Do we have more federal data to look at?
There's one more federal data for 2017 snapshot, and that is the by party. And so with this slide, I think what jumps out at you right away is the amount of red on the screen here. And so what you can see for active federal judges is that the majority of active federal judges serving on the bench has been nominated by a Republican president, and you can see that that's not only true for all active and senior status judges, but it's even a greater percentage. And so I think the thing that jumped out at me right away that I'll mention is that George W. Bush and Ronald Reagan nominated half of the sitting, like the judges that make law for the state of Louisiana still. So, those are two and much, several presidents ago, still having a profound effect on who decides law in the state of Louisiana. Something to think about.
And again, that speaks to the length of the pipeline, that especially when you have judges that are nominated and then can hold these positions for decade after decade, that who gets to who has the power to nominate and who can influence those nominations can have profound effects for a very long period of time.
Absolutely. So who was of age and had the service requirements and had gone to law school and served as an attorney during the Reagan administration that could be appointed to a federal position, and that person is still many years, decades after that president making law in the state of Louisiana.
So I think we're ready to look at some long-term data as well.
No, this is where it gets interesting.
We're talking about is this about the Louisiana Supreme Court? Do I have the right info?
Yeah. So I think a quick note I'll just say is that we're going to talk through basically the four major levels of courts. So the Supreme Court, the courts of appeal, the district courts, and then the city and parish courts. So starting with this table of the Supreme Court of Louisiana, this is a snapshot of what I like to call the data behind the data. So for every court, I have data that looks like this. It has the seat, it has the name of the incumbent that's held the position from 1992 to present day. And what we can see from this table is that every single judge on the Louisiana Supreme Court in 1992 was a white male Democrat. And what we can also see by looking at the final name and race, sex, and party information in this table by seat is that there are 5 Republicans, white male Republicans, 1 white male with the party or party designation of no party, switched from Democrat to no party in the last election. And then we have 1 person of color, who happens to be the Chief Justice, Justice Burnett Johnson, who an African American female Democrat, and at the moment the only Democrat on the Louisiana Supreme Court. And so I think in the last 20 years, what we have seen with this data is that 20 unique individuals have held the position. So out of 30 possible positions on the Louisiana Supreme Court. So that's not that many in terms of the time span. Overall, cumulatively, women have held 23% of the positions on the Supreme Court. Women have held seats in the 2nd and the 5th districts, even though men now hold those seats. And so I think the tale that this data tells is that reversals can happen. So even though for a period of time in the early 2000s, there were 3 women on the court, which is close to half, which is the highest that it's ever been, we now are in a position in 2020, if Judge Johnson decides to not run for re-election, that there might not be any women on the court again. And so I think we want to think about, does the Supreme Court reflect the population and the diversity that we hope to see by the people making the laws for the state of Louisiana?
And I think we would move down from there to appeals court. Is that correct?
It is. And so I think that we're going to look at the, I actually don't, I'm not quite sure if there is a slide for...
We have one on the screen right now.
Yeah, that's actually the slide for district courts. And so what if we hop to district courts and then we'll come back
will talk about
to appeals in just a second. And so I think so thinking about district courts, I think that the point that jumped out about this court that really struck me as shocking is that in 1992 you can see that the number of non-white judges was 22.61%, and that 25 years later, even though there was incremental increases in reversals, that we only made a 1.32% gain to 23.93%. And so that pretty much is a straight line. If in fact, if we flip to that next slide, I've presented a graph so that you can see, so this is slide 10, we can see kind of what that looks like. So in the last 25 years, the number of judges in the district court, so let's remember that the district court's the largest number. There's over 1,000. It's like 1,161 judges in the last 25 years. So the number of judges has almost doubled over that time, and yet the number of non-white judges has remained largely the same. And so I think that was a pretty stark realization. And I guess I'd like to unpack that just for a second about district courts, that of the 42 district courts, so Louisiana has 42 judicial districts, black women judges have served or serve on only 6 of those 42 district courts. Black men have served on only 13 district courts, and women serve or have served on only 28 of those 42 district courts. And so thinking about where the majority of law is made, most people, most normal, ordinary citizens, if they have a matter before the court, it will be at the district court level. And yet we don't see that gender and racial diversity that we would hope. In fact, we see the worst example out of every level of court of racial diversity in Louisiana.
So it certainly seems, well, I think we have to move along here a bit.
Yeah, no, we do.
But I think it's probably safe to say, correct me if I'm wrong, that we still have a hangover in Louisiana from a far less representative time period where the people that are in charge are not don't reflect the diversity of the population at large.
Without a doubt, certainly, absolutely at the levels, the Supreme Court, the Court of Appeals, and the district courts. And so I think the next thing, just to quickly give a snapshot for New Orleans, because I think the viewers will really be interested in this. So we pull up slide 11 and we see this typical format of numbers presented for the number of women for both the civil, so it's actually all 4 courts that are in Orleans Parish, so civil, criminal, juvenile, and city courts. You can see 57% of the courts in 2017 were women, and you can see the overall 25-year total is 46.65. And I would just point out that that's actually the 25-year average. So the 25-year average in New Orleans is higher by almost 10 points than any other court in the state for one single year for 2017. And so it's profound how diverse the New Orleans Parish courts are.
Just tremendously different from the rest of the state.
Tremendously. And so if we show the last slide, we'll quickly put up the racial demographics for Orleans Parish. Same format. You have information for civil, criminal, juvenile, and city courts. And you can see the 2017 total for non-white judges is 71.43%. That's more than triple the number in any other court at the 2017 point. In fact, the number in terms of non-white judges for the overall state of Louisiana is raised because of this number. And then finally, we have 58% for the 25-year average. So again, New Orleans is a really unique spot.
So we have very quickly run out of time. We have maybe 45 seconds. What would you like to emphasize to our viewers?
Yeah, so quickly, I would like to say I would like to recommend the next steps. Of course, reach out to Louisiana Courts Matter to get involved. I think there's one more slide, and it's how to get a copy of this report if you want to look at the data a little bit more further. Look into the data a little bit in depth, and then how to reach me. So my email and a Twitter handle. And last but not least, I would also like to thank the people that paid for this research or sponsored this research and this report release, including the Newcomb College Institute, Tulane University Law School, American Constitution Society, and of course, the Louisiana Courts Matter.
Heather Johnson, thank you for another interesting episode of The Humanist Perspective. I don't know how that would seem to the audience, but